Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Joe Chris, and I'm from the social enterprise not-for-profit Opus Independence based in Sheffield. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Sorry, I had the live stream back on in the background as well, hence the echo. Thanks very much for joining us tonight, everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to run tonight's event. So the Festival of Debate is an annual festival that happens across South Yorkshire every spring, but we're very pleased to run some events outside of that programme as well. And the festival and the events we run outside of it are all about providing a platform to discuss the key social and economic issues of the day. And today I'm very pleased that we'll be talking about how we can build a democratic Yorkshire. Now, Yorkshire has a very strong sense of identity, but no democratic power. Current plans for devolution are woefully inadequate and confused. Tonight's webinar will explore what a truly democratic Yorkshire could look like, and to give a few kind of broad outlines of some of the points we'll be covering tonight. This could include things like regional power, a parliament for Yorkshire, neighbourhood democracy, power devolved to the citizens of Yorkshire, and constitutional reform, looking at how Yorkshire's powers could be protected. Tonight we'll have two expert panelists who I'm very pleased who will be joining us. So we're going to hear from them both in turn. Initially, they're going to have a kind of 15-minute speech each, and then we'll get into a shared discussion, which will be followed by an audience Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions or comments tonight for tonight's guests, please do pop them in the Q&A box, which is the box at the bottom of the screen there. You can see yeah, there's already a question in there, so clearly we're doing very well. And yeah, we will get to those points in shared discussion and in the Q&A a little bit later on. And now I'd like to introduce our first guest tonight, our first guest speaker, who is Ed Straw. Now, Ed Straw is a leading thinker on politics and government today and a member of the Independent Constitutionalists UK and an expert on the workings of the modern state. Ed will describe alternatives to the current system and explore how participative representative democracy, PRD, could create a Yorkshire where everyone could get involved. Now, Ed, could you please turn on your video and your mic? Lovely. Hi, Ed, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you very much.
Lovely. If it's all right with you, I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I mean, it's just slightly confusing because the only thing I can see on the screen is actually myself, which I'm not sure I do. So I'm imagining all the people out there. I was going to start with two stories. One concerns the town of Frome in Somerset, and several years ago they were facing a problem, the GP surgery, because they had too much demand, and so they looked at recruiting more doctors and nurses, but for whatever reason, I don't know whether it was funding or just availability, they couldn't recruit them. So the practice manager and the GP lead said, well, can we restrict demand, you know, look at the other side of the equation. And they started looking at ways of doing that. And to cut a long story short, they basically got in a community development worker who, first of all, established all of the voluntary organizations that existed there. And it turned out there were 450 of them just for a town of 28,000, some of them county-wide. And everything from, you know, dog walking, knitting monthly, sheds, macular dystrophy, and so on and so forth. And the next thing they did was to seek to connect patients with these societies, these groups. And they did this by talking to the individual patients and finding an interest, finding an enthusiasm. Bearing in mind, a lot of the people were isolated, sitting at home, maybe, you know, the next biscuit, the next fag, and didn't have that very important thing of social connection. And that very important thing of social connection, we find that if you want to increase your lifespan, Well, I mean, do these things, but it's not stop smoking, stop drinking, have loads of tests. The biggest determinant of lifespan is face-to-face contact. So they started to get people one by one engaged in these various groups. And hey presto, what did they find? Less people coming to doctor's surgeries, because often they're coming there for, in effect, for social contact. But on top of that, what they then found was that the rate of emergency chronic admissions to the county hospital at Weston-super-Mare started to fall. And over a 4-year period, they fell by 20%. In the rest of the county, they went up by 20%. And this was because people were getting more active in their lives. They were getting involved. They were, in essence, taking care more of their own health. And you found this extraordinary thing where we call it compassion, but compassion for other people, and compassion then turned into some action, in this case, getting people involved in local groups, had this dramatic effect on costs. And so the peculiar thing that, you know, if you want a really hard-hitting cost reduction program in the health service, do it locally through compassion. This contrasted with the many top-down, often chaotic and destructive, centrally driven initiatives, as they're called, with lots of performance measures, targets, and all the rest of it coming down from Whitehall. That is a real eye-opener to what is possible when local people have local control over a service and can design it themselves to fit the needs. The second story I want to tell you is basically, how did I end up in a situation of saying it's essentially, when it comes down to government, it's not the people. Although I appreciate we do have some fairly awful ones at present. It's not the people, it's the system. So I got involved in what you might call the New Labour project in the late 80s with Neil Kinnock and policy reviews. And then I got into being, when Labour got into office, an advisor to government ministers, to some of the senior staffers, generating policy, sitting around august tables with loads of civil servants, lords, MPs, and so on and so forth, and indeed in think tanks. And whilst some things happened in the early days, which were good, the more time I spent in it, and I was there in one way, shape or form, more or less till the end, it became apparent to me that no matter all of this talking with all of these important people, very little actually got through to beneficial change on the ground. Because fundamentally, I mean, the same point as Froome, trying to make things happen in a country, if you just take England, of 50 million people, is often just not possible. I now live in North Wales, and there's a lot of talk about independence or proper devolution here. And the sense is that that's very much the same feeling that there is in Yorkshire, that people, it's not about some sort of outbreak of nationalism or people cheering at rugby matches. They're called armchair nationalists here. It's about people wanting to have some control and influence over their lives, about saying, can we put our arms around a piece of the population, as it were, and work collaboratively with that piece of the population in order to improve our lives. So I started, having got to the end of New Labour, I started to look around and think, well, how can you run these systems differently? We've got this system, but aren't there other systems? And so I started to look around at the world. And one of the things that struck me most strongly was that typically the countries that are happiest and often most successful have a population of a maximum of 10 million. And so you look at Denmark, at Finland, Costa Rica has come to the fore recently, New Zealand. All of these are countries of under 10 million, and yet they seem to function remarkably well. You look at then a country like Germany, and yeah, it's got 83 million, but it has a lot of devolution. So it's divided into 16 Länder, or 16 regions. And then within those regions, it's divided again into cities and towns and villages, all naturally occurring groups, if you like. We're not sticking sort of two towns together to make for administrative convenience. And it's divided. The region decides on its constitution through proper mechanisms. That then translates into the systems of governing there at local level. What you then find is that they have quite a lot of variety. So in some cases, you'll find councils more or less similar to the ones that we experience. In others, and I appreciate we now have a very small number of executive mayors, you'll find executive mayors. But some of the principal things which also make quite a big difference there is the amount of funding that is raised locally is very much larger. So in Britain, it's 1% of funding is raised locally. And in Germany, it's 16%.
Ed, your audio seems to have got a little bit worse. I'm just wondering, can you just pause a second, try and... We seem to have lost your audio.
Okay.
Oh, you're back. You're back now. Sorry, you're back. So
yeah.
Just carry on, Ed. Carry on.
Okay. Fine. Sorry about that. I hope the internet is not going to go on the blink, in which case I'll have to rush somewhere else. Yeah. So there we have 16% to 1%. What happens in England is essentially all the money is collected via general taxation. It's sent up to the centre and it's sent down again. Of course, if you're raising that money locally, then you have much more control over that money. The powers, local powers, there was a very interesting piece on what had happened to COVID. And how various countries, jurisdictions had responded to it. And I think it was Trebin in Germany. They had an executive mayor. He happened to be a professor of mathematics, which struck me as a rather more useful qualification than a PPE from Oxford. And he had the power to decide quite a lot, and this was specifically in relation to care homes and the way in which they responded to care homes. He had the power to decide with his General Assembly there, to decide what to do. And their results were much better. If you then go on and look at Switzerland, you find that they have built into their constitution a requirement for participatory democracy. So yeah, they have the representation thing, obviously with PR, not first past the post. But then if citizens want to call in a decision or they want to make a decision through a process of deliberation and finally referendum, then they can do that. So you want a park and ride scheme in Geneva. The independent information is brought together, not the sort of free for all say anything punch up that was the Brexit referendum. You bring this independent information together, you put it on the table, it's open, it's transparent, you discuss it and you say, on the one hand, it's going to cost this, on the other hand, you get this. You vote, you take a decision. So there are lots of different ways of organising local government. And I think the crucial thing for me in relation to Yorkshire is that it's not just about devolution, but it's also about the type of government that you have. And of course, that won't just be at the regional level, it'll be at the city and the town and the village level. The powers that are there, the funding that's there, the structure that you have, executive mayors, I think are probably the way to go, but with a very careful and effective scrutiny and feedback role for the Assembly. So it's not just about devolution, but it's also about the quality of government, because I think if this is to succeed for Yorkshire to have a parliament, you have to show people how government is going to be better and much better than the sort of, what I call it, the Westminster Whitehall shit show that we're so used to. And in order to do that, it has to go into a constitution. It has to be entrenched. That means that, for example, you can't change the rules as you go along. So if you have a rule that says, well, you can't take on consultancies and lobby for contracts, you can't, as a government, just decide that we're going to wave that to one side. That's in the Constitution. It's dealt with separately and enforced separately. So I think there's an opportunity now for Yorkshire to think about and start designing its constitution. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Ed, for your talk there. If you could turn your video and microphone off now, that would be lovely. Much appreciated. And if you've got any questions or comments on what you've just heard from Ed, please do pop it in the chat. Feel free to start a little debate amongst yourselves, and obviously we'll be getting to any of the questions put in the Q&A box in the latter section of tonight's event. I'm now very pleased to introduce Dr. Simon Duffy, who is the president of Citizen Network and one of the founders of the neighbourhood democracy movement. Simon will argue that Yorkshire could lead the way in meaningful constitutional reform and describe the emergence of a campaign for a democratic Yorkshire. Hi, Simon, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Joe. It's nice to be with you.
That's great. Thanks for joining us. I'll hand over to you now, Simon.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so that's Joe's introduction includes lots of labels there, doesn't it? Some of which I'm a bit loath to use, like president of Citizen Network, which sounds far too grand. But I think this concept of citizenship, which is implied by what Ed said, but I'd like to kind of insert that into the conversation as well, because in the end, it's the people that are doing the work. Like, government is a description of how we organize our conversations. But what's really missing, in a sense, is citizenship. It's our sense that this is our place. This is our stuff. That's what the word politics, when in its original Greek sense, meant. It was like the stuff of the community, the stuff of the people, the stuff you're meant to know about if you live somewhere. That's what politics is actually meant to mean, or what it originally meant. And now it means the stuff that happens elsewhere, the stuff we've got nothing to do with. So I suppose in my sense, what I'm interested in, how we can reverse that, or how we can reclaim politics as a kind of aspect of our basic citizenship. I agree with a lot of things that, well, everything I think Ed said in a way, but I suppose I might approach this from a couple of different angles as well. Joe mentioned also that at the end of last year, and this, as Ed mentioned it, COVID was very interesting for revealing how powerfully people can respond to crises as citizens. So we saw lots of citizen action in response to the COVID crisis, much of which has been maintained, although there are pressures from on top to kind of reduce that, and life as it's currently organised gets in the way of that. But one of the things we're doing at the moment is organising the neighbourhood democracy movement to sustain and strengthen that kind of neighbourhood action. Because I think at some level, whatever moves away from the kind of immediate neighbourhood is going to start entering into the domain of representative democracy, other people making decisions, however open it is. I mean, we couldn't almost do worse than our current representative democratic system. But I'm kind of interested in like the participative element as well of everyday life citizenship. I'm still kind of intrigued why our standard for democracy has dropped so far. You know, if you go back to Aristotle, he describes a pretty sophisticated democratic system in Athens. And again, people always say, oh, Simon, they had slaves. Well, they did have quite a lot of slaves, although not so many. And women were excluded from political life. But about a quarter of the population, or the adult population, had immense control over the life of the state, of the life of the community. And what people don't realize is that actually most of that action was at the level of the demi, which is the neighborhood in Athens. So I completely agree with Ed that scale is massively important. In fact, I often give the example of Iceland as a place which has 300 and so thousand people. That's half the size of Sheffield, the city I'm a proud citizen of. Half the size of Sheffield, 300,000 people. It's got a president, it's got a constitution, it's got a parliament, it's got 78 municipalities to which it devolves critical powers. Think about that. In Sheffield has none of that. Sheffield has none of that. Yorkshire has none of that. So we're a very weird place in the UK as well. And that's a kind of other. So I think it's really important to start having a conversation about democracy, what it really means, and where it really starts, I think. And yeah, I suppose I'm also representing Democratic Yorkshire, which is just an emerging project, which I think it's fair to say that quite a few people who have been in and around the Yorkshire Party and who are inspired by the idea of a Parliament for Yorkshire have also started to say, we also need, that's a great strategy. So although I'm not a member of the Yorkshire Party, I'll be happily speaking at their conference later in the year, and you know, all strength to their elbow as far as I can see. But I think it's also important to engage with people who don't want to engage with party politics or come at this from different political persuasions, who actually they should have a big stake in having a conversation about what kind of Yorkshire we want to live in. And one of the reasons I was very keen to get involved and support the Democratic Yorkshire movement was that the people I've met through the kind of movement for a parliament in Yorkshire share that sense that Ed talked about, and I feel, which is that, you know, this isn't all about just moving power from Westminster to York or wherever. Another big debate is where a parliament for Yorkshire might be. But actually, it's much more about working out how to organise power right through the constitution of Yorkshire, if you like. So, yeah, that's kind of the perspective I'm representing here. Is there's kind of intertwined questions about what is citizenship, where does democracy really come from, and what is the potential for Yorkshire? I suppose a slightly more negative thing I want to say, I suppose, is that my sense is that some of the problems we face at the moment are actually cataclysmic problems. So I think one of the challenges we face a little bit is that we're kind of used to being badly led. And actually you can kind of get used to the fact that idiots rule us, and that they all went to Eton and Oxford and all sit around in Westminster and Whitehall, and it's got nothing to do with us. In a way, you can wash your hands of it, can't you? And just say, well, that's just it. We just have to accept that these people are born to rule. They organise to protect their interests. It's a fixed system. You know, let's just get on with our lives. I guess that's kind of natural, isn't it? But I don't think it's going to help us when it comes to a climate crisis, which isn't just about Yorkshire being a little bit warmer. It's about cataclysmic environmental harm to all human life, all animal life, the environment, the very sustainability of the planet. Think about what it takes to start tackling a problem like that. In the end, it also takes citizen action. It's the citizens who are the consumers that drive up the CO2 emissions. It's the citizens who can choose to or not choose to take back control of Yorkshire Water, who can organise to create sustainable energy systems, or who can fail to organise to do those things. These things are only either things we choose to do or things we opt out of choosing to do. It's the citizens who do that. If you really believe, I mean, COP26 says it all, doesn't it? There's been 26 of these COPs, and carbon emissions have gone steadily upwards with no drop at all. The only drop actually has been created by COVID, nothing else, no political action, no economic strategies. So, that's a cataclysmic, world life-threatening event that I think the only real solution to is democracy. It ain't going to be the elites sorting out that problem. And I think the economic insecurity of the modern world is growing, not decreasing. And, that's why also in Sheffield, together with friends at Opus, we created UBI Lab, that's Universal Basic Income Lab Sheffield. We need to start reimagining the welfare state and start creating the kind of security that people need. Again, local people. Notice that these ideas are taking off in Scotland and Wales. Why is that happening? Well, actually, because at a human level, when politicians, civil society folk, ordinary citizens start talking about these issues away from the pantomime of Westminster, these are naturally sensible solutions. And I think, as Ed says, Yorkshire has a population of just over 5 million. It would make a very good sized country. It could easily be having sensible conversations about its own destiny and organising for that. It's our choice not to get behind that. So, the other couple of things I think are worth thinking about. One is the level of, after the banking crash, did you notice how the scapegoating increased? It's almost like the 1930s, the attacks on disabled people, the attacks on the poor, being blamed for a banking crisis. What was that about? The impact of that is still pushing through our society. We're seeing death rates increase, we're seeing hate crime increase, a politically driven agenda to attack the weakest in society. Would Yorkshire have done that? I doubt it. And again, Ed has talked a little bit about this, so I won't go on about it too much. But again, what really strikes me is how ignorant we are about the level of centralisation in the UK. The UK is a really weird place. You just cannot find anywhere that has so many powers sucked into basically a London-based institution, Whitehall. They control almost everything. Even the things we think of as local services are actually controlled from Whitehall. It's amazingly bad. You would not run anything like this. And yet we just treat it as kind of natural. So just to finish, really, I guess, I live in Yorkshire, although my family's kind of Manchester Irish, and I've lived all over the shop. I lived in Scotland quite a lot in my life, which was great. But I feel like a Yorkshire, I'm going to say Yorkshire man, but I'm one of the Yorkshire folk now. One of the great things I think about Yorkshire is that I've felt welcomed. My family felt welcomed, and I feel like I belong here and I never want to leave. But what, as a Yorkshire citizen, I want to do is try and help make Yorkshire a place that really is God's own country and not against anywhere else. Let us be a beacon. Let us network and support other places. Let us welcome people from different countries into Yorkshire. We don't need to be frightened of difference. We don't need to be frightened of different people coming here. We need people. But I just think Yorkshire could be an amazing place if we gave ourselves half a chance. That's my little talk, Joe.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Simon, for your talk, and to Ed as well. Ed, if you'd like to turn on your video and your microphone and rejoin us, that would be lovely. I feel slightly duty-bound to maybe respond quickly to a comment from just Cesare in the chat, talking about how we should have made perhaps a thought of trying to make this event more democratic and be allowed to sort of bring in more different voices. And I think, Cesare, if you'd like to, we can probably I can allow you to speak later on if you'd like to articulate a sort of a more complex point. So I'm totally open to new suggestions of different formats and different ways of facilitating open meetings and making sure different voices are are involved. So yeah, if you've got any other further thoughts, you can maybe add some in the comment section as well. Just Ed, if you could turn on your video and your microphone when you get a chance, and you can rejoin us. Yes. Lovely. Thanks for joining us back. I suppose just to kind of start off and facilitate discussion, I suppose I was struck really about, and very convincingly, and I think a lot of people would really recognise the importance of local neighbourhood democracy and the importance of increasing and devolving decision-making powers on a local neighbourhood level, and all the positive outcomes that might relate from further citizen engagement in those processes. But I'm just, I suppose, wanting to get to maybe is there a slight friction here between thinking about local neighbourhood democracy and then thinking about how we build a democratic Yorkshire? If you think about I was struck as well, I think, Ed, when you talked about almost the optimum sizes of sort of democratic locations and places, and it struck me recently, just read Sapiens by Novel Harry, and he talks about it being 150 people sort of being our capacity for sort of a good life, which is obviously considerably smaller. And I just wanted to maybe see if we could sort of get into this a little bit about this idea of kind of what level of sort of devolution and organisation here do you think is optimum? Obviously, we've got the mayoral system, which is still relatively newly introduced across the UK. It's not everywhere yet. And yeah, I just thought, how do you think that this desire for local neighbourhood democracy transpires into the sense of kind of regional places of identity? There's a Northern Independence Party movement. There's other campaigns for
Cornwall.
Yes, and Cornwall, which is probably the oldest one. Yeah, did you like to respond to that? Maybe you, Ed, first.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the sense that, yeah, you take Yorkshire, you take the 5 million, as many other places and countries do, and then you decide. But I mean, I think one of my concerns about devolution to Scotland has been that it sort of went to Holyrood, to Edinburgh, but then they centralised the police forces, and it's like, I'm not sure, devolution doesn't stop at the regional level. It doesn't stop at the Yorkshire level. Indeed, if you take the Swiss constitution, it says something along the lines of essentially all things will be done locally, except that which is better done for national regulation or national relationships or efficiency at the national level. So if you like, it starts at the bottom. So I think if we sort of start to think about how we would construct a constitution for Yorkshire on the basis of the local level, and the local level is almost beyond formal structures of local government, because one of the things that has got so missing as well, first of all, government has got more and more centralized, and secondly, businesses, and particularly global businesses, have become more and more dominant and dominating in our lives. One of the things that we need to emphasize is civic society. And this is just groups of people getting together, like the doctor's practice did in Frome, and deciding that actually this is what we need to do here, or this is what we need to do here. There's quite a, here in North Wales, there's quite a move to local food production and local food sourcing. We're just getting on and doing it. Now, there's a great advantage actually if the local government gets involved, as they did in Preston, and starts to build on that and to bring forward mechanisms that when they're doing their purchasing and the schools are doing its purchasing and the health service and so on, they're also privileging local and enabling local suppliers. So this is not an either or. This is that to consider and think about what happens where. There's a bloke called de Tocqueville who wrote a book about in the 18th century on American democracy, and he came from France and he was trying to work out why American democracy seemed to work so much better. One of the things he put his finger on was that there what he called the art of association. There was a natural art of association of people just getting together and fixing something. Now, if you think about where America was at that stage with a lot of pioneers and new people coming to a country with no government whatsoever, the only way things got done was by people getting together, collaborating and fixing things. And so it's almost a cultural shift to get away from this notion that everything is done to us and for us centrally by some distant thing, be it government or company, to a mindset that says, no, we're going to fix things. After that, you go through and you'd certainly look at Germany and their structures with the neighborhood, the village level, with the town level, with the city level, with the regional level, and you'd look at what powers there are distributed there. You'd look at the way in which the funding works. You'd look at the way they're organized, and then you'd say, well, it seems sensible that that should go there and that should go there. Now, at this point, you should bear in mind that every policy is an experiment. And this is one of the other things that came to me loud and clear when I was active in central government, is that the whole political process is built on this notion of the end state fallacy. So here we are, we offer you this bag of goodies at an election, and the other lot offer this bag of goodies, and you go, yeah, we'll have this bag of goodies and this bag of people. But if you look at anything, housing, welfare, taxation, particularly the whole current economic system, our response to climate change, every time you set out a policy, in practice, it is an experiment. So at that point, you have to say to yourself, well, look, this isn't just about powers, it's about adaptability and actually flexibility and deciding and not having unconstrained powers just to change everything and throw it all up in the air if you don't like the rules, but through a proper process to change where things are done as in practice they unfold.
Great, thanks, Ed. And coming to you, Simon, I suppose, to respond to that question there again, the original question again, looking at that slight friction between sort of neighbourhood and local, regional democracy, and it being centralised in different places. Have you got a response to that?
Yeah, well, again, I agree with things Ed's saying. I mean, again, it's this word. I think it seems quite a poncy word in English, doesn't it? Subsidiarity, and I really like, and I know not everybody's a big fan of the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church is definition of subsidiarity. It's a sin to steal somebody else's decisions. And in other words, it's to reverse the assumption that's become normal in England that power belongs in Westminster, and somehow what we've got to do is kind of drag some of it in our direction. A game we've been losing, I think it's important to notice. Again, if you listen to the political rhetoric, you would think that we were always on the point of some beautiful moment of devolution. But if you look at actually any area of real public policy, things have got progressively worse. It was a point where education was a local matter. It's not anymore.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. So I think that the issue is a little bit like, I think this relates to Ed's thing about the end state, but I also see it a little bit in, earlier today, I was in a great meeting in a way hosted by Compass about constitutional reform, or actually they didn't talk about constitutional reform, democratic reform, parliamentary reform, and he had like 30 or 40 different people from different agencies all talking about their preferred version of what reality should be like, which is fine. I tend to think about it kind of like strategically, like how is the change process going to happen? In Scotland, and I think this is an important element of it, one of the change processes was that people met together in Scotland in a kind of informal constitutional convention at a civil society level. It wasn't actually the politicians who sorted it out. It was folk in Scotland. I think it was a Scottish minister started this off, and then they brought together, so that's like a vicar, I should say. And they brought together trade unions, civil society people, and then the story of the kind of what kind of Scotland do we want to create and what kind of organization do we want to that. That's what eventually led into effectively the GIT. I mean, Ed talked about this. There were a few good things at the beginning of the New Labour period, but often these things were given to them, really. Like, we'd like you to do this, please. Give us devolution. You stole it from us, 20, 30 years ago. Can we have it now? It looks like this. And so it happened. That was good. But as Ed says, actually, it was a very centralized devolution revolution. And working in Scotland as I do, you do not see a movement actually towards greater subsidiarity in Scotland, really. You've actually seen progressive centralization. So that is the risk if you just say, well, we'll have a parliament for Yorkshire. And that's the only conversation we're having. Well, I think then there are risks that you will end up with something that's a bit clumsy. One of the reasons we've developed the neighbourhood democracy movement is actually to kind of empower people which I think is most real people, actually, the level of engagement they want to have politically is much more local. I think that party politics is kind of death to genuine politics, actually. And that's what, when I was doing a report on Barnsley's movement towards use of wards, what local people said is what put them off getting involved in ordinary community activity was party politics. They were frightened to death that they're being basically drawn into some Labour, Independent, Tory, Lib Dem spat. That wasn't that's not how they wanted to improve their neighbourhood. They wanted to just get on and do stuff. So I think you got to tap into that, really. And I think personally that I just feel like that strategically, we need both conversations to emerge. And from a rational point of view, Ed's right, there's a whole set of things you could do to kind of figure out, hey, let's look at Germany, let's look at Switzerland. I'm going to keep coming back to Iceland because it's probably more extreme. Okay. I like the idea of actually let's devolve it all to the neighbourhoods of Sheffield. There are those 78 municipalities in Iceland match beautifully the 140 plus neighbourhoods of Sheffield. Why couldn't, at a neighbourhood level, we shape primary education, social care, healthcare, and lots of other services are organised at that level in Iceland? Iceland's a sophisticated place, a good modern welfare state with good respect for human rights. It jailed its bankers, remember. The only place that actually put the people who caused the crisis into jail. And I think that's because it's a democratic place. So that's where I'm coming from, Jay. It's not, I think there's always a tension. There are always battles for power. What we've done is we've kind of eradicated really any structures at the genuine neighbourhood level. Even when they emerge, they often get stomped on by local government, often itself being stomped on by central government. So I think people like me and Angela Fell and other friends are trying to work out how can we bring that to life? How can we use networking and self-organization to get that story going? But alongside stories like the Yorkshire story, it's not one story.
Great, thanks, Simon. And I'm just going to ask one more question before I'm going to start bringing in some of the comments and some of the questions in the Q&A from the audience. I suppose it's partly been touched on some of the comments, which I suppose is what are the routes to this kind of devolution? If we were going to look at specifically about how we best engage in with power, ensure sort of further devolution? How are we best organising sort of within our local communities, to help push forward this movement? What do you suggest are the best sort of routes and avenues that are open to us to help support this sort of process?
I mean, I think, and I was picking up a comment or comments in the chats about someone, sorry, I missed the name immediately, but someone was saying, well, look, it's all very well having a constitution for Yorkshire, but if we're going to have one, we're going to have to change the constitution for the UK. We're going to have to change the constitution for the UK without a doubt, and that's regardless of today's discussion. It's getting worse and worse and worse, and we need a proper modern constitution. Now, if we take it at the Yorkshire level, first of all, the way this thing starts to get on the table and get talked about, when someone sort of comes along and says, what do you think of one of those? Sorry, that's my daughter. What do you think of one of those? Do you like it? It does this. You can do, and suddenly I've got something to get hold of. Suddenly I've got this. It becomes a thing. We now have a well thought through, functional Yorkshire constitution. Then it is politics, I'm afraid, and I dislike politics as a means for getting things done intensely. I think it has a really bad record, but that in terms of changing what's going on in Britain, we have to address it at the constitutional level. My experience is that this particular C word, as distinct from the other one, which sends people into apoplexy sometimes, this one sends people to sleep, because we're not used in Britain to thinking about constitution and its effect. If you're in France, they've had any number of constitutions and they're constantly thinking about them, and they're aware of how powerful they are. So I think step one is, make it a thing. Here is, this has gone beyond just people chatting. Here is a very clear, well thought through, organised, considered proposal. We have to start, how does politics work? We talk to each other. In Wales, there's a lot of interesting discussions like these going on, which are saying, well, it's not just about having independence or more devolution. How is the country going to be different? Simon's talked a bit about that, but let's think about taxation. Taxation is another complete muddle. We penalise people for going to work through income tax. We penalise people for employing people through national insurance. Is this a good idea? One of my colleagues on the IC UK has written a book called We Are Rent, which makes a very powerful case for shifting taxation out of income and onto land and property. So there's something else to think about. So I think the more these discussions are going on, the better. And you widen and widen the discussion. Things with government centrally can only get worse, I can assure you of that. You may think they're bad now, but they can only get worse given the system we've got. So let's start pushing that agenda. If I can pick up just one other comment to sort of reinforce the point. Someone said here, no to executive mayors. We mustn't have single dictators, as it were, of various areas. It's worth reminding ourselves that the German constitution, which was designed by the US and the UK for two reasons. One is, this is a really good way of running a country. Pity they didn't apply it to us. The second is we need to make absolutely damn sure that we never again have one person who can be all powerful. So, part of the point of devolution is you're getting power distributed, but also then within the devolution, it's very important. Yeah, you don't elect an executive dictator, but you have powers within that structure, let's say it's within Leeds City Council, of scrutiny and check. One of the conclusions that I've come to in looking at systems of governing is that the biggest hole is the absence of feedback. So people pass a law, a regulation, a policy, a program, set up an organization, a quango, whatever it is, and it's shut down. And it's only then by exception that someone says, often years and years later, this doesn't work, or it's having the reverse effect. But systematically, we don't go through and say, well, we did this. Now what's happening and what has happened? You can't run an organization like that. If businesses did that, they would be bust. If you set off to cross the Atlantic and said, well, we're just going to cross the Atlantic without checking on your instruments as to where you were, the rest of it, and what sales you've got on. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yeah, you've frozen a bit, Ed. Yeah, but I could hear you okay.
Yeah.
All sorts of things suddenly flicked up and said they were changing. Anyway, sorry, but you have to have feedback. So one of the things that I hope would be in the Yorkshire Constitution is what I call a fourth separation of powers, which is for feedback in terms of what I call a resulture. So people do things, but then independently comes back, this is what has happened as a result of what you've done. And then you have abandonment powers and other powers to course correct.
Great, thanks, Ed. Simon, can I ask you to respond as well to the same question, but maybe have a slightly more concise answer, and we'll just get on to some of the. That's all right, Ed. So I was trying to.
Yeah, no, point taken.
And we'll get into. You mentioned the Yorkshire Constitution, and it's been there's been chat on that in the comments. So I'd really like to bring in people's comments here. But Simon, if you could maybe just briefly respond to the same point about directions for of travel and how we build this movement for sort of democracy.
I think one thing we have to accept, I don't think it means we should not treat this as an urgent issue, is that we are a long way from any kind of rational, sensible strategy or I mean, the state of play here is like about as crap as it could be. And, this conversation, just us talking now, has come out of a group of people saying, well, we need to at least begin somewhere in having this conversation about Yorkshire, in parallel to, I say, the exact existing political party, which is the Yorkshire Party, which gets votes, and there are some Yorkshire Party councillors, so it's not an insubstantial institution. But this was an attempt from point zero, really, to say, how do we engage the folk of Yorkshire and start to engage civil society in Yorkshire, who never talk about this? The charities, the universities, they're not having this conversation. So how do we begin it? So there's one really simple strategy, which is just a bit like Ed's, like, here's a phone, but here's just talking about it. It is how we make stuff happen. We've got to talk about it. So that was what really this event is about. Let's just start a conversation and see if we can start weaving it in. And I think I mentioned really already the neighbourhood democracy strategy, which is let's think about how we organise from the grassroots. Like neighbourhood democracy isn't all about let's have secretly its plan is just to have a Yorkshire Parliament. No, we want the power, but the rationality of having properly distributed power is going to seem even clearer to people who are looking at the reality of how crap that is from a neighbourhood perspective. So that's an important strategy. The third one I'd say is, which I try to do really, is I think we need to start connecting some of the policy things that we care passionately about to these constitutional issues. So Gavin Barker, who's also in Citizen Network, he talks about the lack of a constitution as the elephant in the room. If you care about tax policy, or if you care about the environment, if you care about just about anything, but don't care about the constitution, then at some level you don't really know what you're doing, because you are in a sense just like begging for favors from politicians, hoping, just as Ed describes, that your lot get in and give you what you hoped for. And the problem is, even if they do, in the remote chance that your lot eventually get in, the system undermines it anyway, because it's the system of government and the constitution and the powers and all those structures. So we've got to get people thinking a bit more deeply, really, about how stuff happens, how good stuff is sustained, and why the bad stuff keeps happening. Because it's really all about power and the organization of power and the exploitation of power by those with influence and money as against ordinary citizens. That is constitutional stuff. And it can only be resolved by saying, no, we don't want to live in this kind of place. We need to come up with a different set of ground rules for the place we live in.
Great, thanks, Simon. I'm now going to maybe try and open up this a little bit more and maybe do this a little bit more free-flowing than we'd initially planned, in the sense that audience members, if you put your hand up, I will use the authority that Zoom gives me to allow you to speak. And George McManus, you were first up there, so I'm going to allow you to talk. There you go, George. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Joe. And thanks very much, Simon and Ed, for the background. I found it absolutely enlightening, and so many points that I agree with. I was involved in the Scottish Constitutional Convention in the 1980s, and in with Nick Rainsford writing up the 2004 White Paper, Your Region's Your Choice. That my experience said was that Number 10 didn't want this. Number 10 was the main obstacle because it involved serious constitutional change. Yeah. At that time, we wanted to deliver regional government and assemblies to the whole of England. It simply never happened because the Whitehall establishment decided they were against it because it was diluting their power. The reason I think it worked in Scotland is because John Smith promised it, and Tony Blair couldn't really deny John Smith. That's why I think I agree totally. It has to be a bottom-up process, and we have to give local decision makers a reason to get on board. And that's why I would really like to see a constitutional convention set up for Yorkshire, because I think Yorkshire does have the critical mass to stand on its own as part of the United Kingdom, but in total control of its own education, transport, and economic policy. Because I agreed with a lot of what Ed was saying, but I think at this point in time, to get into the detail of the powers is premature. But involving the whole of civic society, as Ed referred to in Scotland with the Scottish Constitutional Convention, it was virtually impossible for Tony Blair to refuse Scotland because business, churches, voluntary organisations, and all the political parties, with the exception of one, which was the Tory party, got involved in the Scottish Constitutional Convention. But although I knew personally Tories who were very much in favour of Scottish devolution. So I would like to see us do more work on the how, which is why I think we should be asking people through polling, if possible, whether or not they support the idea in principle. Because unless we can take the people with us, then we can't give leadership to their ideas. And then, on the basis of that, if we think there is a real, genuine public support for this, as there was in 2004, Ed, then we can use that as the basis for setting up the parameters for a constitutional convention. Because we're not going to get this without change at national level. But it'll only happen, I feel, if it's a bottom-up process and if we don't give them any other option. And that includes all the Westminster decision makers. Get them involved. Give them ownership of the process as well. See that it's to their advantage. and to the long-term advantage of the UK as both a political and an economic union, that regional government has come of age, and I think Yorkshire could lead on that. Thanks very much for this. I think it's been a brilliant discussion.
Thanks very much, George. Simon and Ed, would you like to respond to those points, and maybe specifically getting into this idea about this Yorkshire constitutional sort of convention, maybe that process as well? That might be interesting. Should we start off with Simon this time?
Well, I mean, one thing, just two quick thoughts, and that's fantastic, George, that you were involved in that. I didn't know that you were on this call, but I think this, and it's interesting that you put the emphasis on, in a way, saving the union, because one of the other cataclysmic things that's, I think, more likely to happen, I think I've kind of rather abandoned the union, is that Scotland will vote to become independent, and that will force a crisis and force a kind of new broken constitutional settlement. And it's actually Scotland, in a way, is the key, is both the hope and the threat to a large extent, I think, in the way this all plays out. I think that if places like Yorkshire actually, stepped forward and started to say, this is a kind of meaningful rethink about how power works in the UK, then you're right. And then that actually could salvage and maybe create a genuinely modern state. But I think that we're on a balance point here where it could easily, I mean, it doesn't, and none of this ends well if we, I think, certainly for England, if Scotland, I think Scotland could be an independent state. If it leaves, the problems it creates for England and the remaining establishment are going to be even more severe. So I think that the whole thing about Scotland and the union is a critical element of this. And I think in terms of the process, well, this is going to sound, I think, and I've seen some of the points in the chat, so this is going to sound really crude. What I just notice in the world is that constitution building is a messy process. I mean, my sister lives in Italy. She described her husband described how the Italian constitution after World War II was created by sticking all the deputies in the parliament and locking the doors. On the other hand, the Athenian constitution, the first democratic constitution, was created by a guy called Solon, who was just given the job of writing it. Now, I mean, there's all sorts of variations, but I guess it's a process. And what I think folk in Yorkshire need to do is just start coming together and doing it. And then you have this problem of where's the legitimacy for that? But in the end, I think the legitimacy comes by doing it, going, this is what we've got, seeing what people think, improving it. But it goes back to Ed's point. If you've got something and you say, this is it, then that's huge improvement over the idea that eventually, theoretically, you might get round to having a process that I find that quite frustrating. I'd rather sit down and go, well, who's up for just writing the thing? And let's begin and let's see what people think with what we do.
Yeah. There's something about luck. If someone knows the proper phrase, but luck is actually a combination of opportunity and being prepared. And I think, or good fortune, that what Simon has just, the opportunity is coming. And I think the point about Scotland, and indeed it's building.
We have briefly lost you, Ed. You have frozen, I'm afraid. I'm sure, hopefully, you'll come back to us relatively soon. Hopefully, you can still hear me as well. Maybe I will move. Nigel Solid, I recognise you've asked a few questions in the Q&A, and I wondered if you'd like to raise your hand in the chat, I can allow you to talk, and you can ask our guest, well, at least Simon, the question in your own hands if you'd so wish, or I can ask the question. We have lost Ed for good. I'm sure he will rejoin us shortly if he can. Nigel, I'm going to allow you to talk, but if you don't want to, I can ask the question instead. Oh, you appear to have disappeared, actually. Oh, no, you're there. There we go. I will, give me 1 second. There you go, Nigel. You should be able to unmute yourself now. Yeah, lovely. You should be able to speak now, Nigel. Ooh, we can't hear you, I'm afraid. No, maybe that is not working, I'm afraid, Nigel. I tell you what, I will read out your question for you, for Simon. Nigel, are you there? Okay, cool. Let's not do that. So Nigel asked the question, shouldn't regional devolution be treated as a stepping stone to a federalised England within a federalised UK? Welcome back, Ed. So we're just answering one of Nigel's questions, which was put in the Q&A, which is, shouldn't regional devolution be treated as a stepping stone to a federalised England within a federalised UK? Simon, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think if a federal UK, as I understand it, would be, it would have to be quite radical federalism, more radical than the US federalism, because I think, Scotland, if it does agree to be part of the United Kingdom, it's never agreed to be part of the United Kingdom other than a long time ago. It's just asked for the powers to be more independent, and then said, oh well, no, we don't want to be completely independent. But it's never because it were voted into or locked itself into a proper federal constitution. So we don't have a constitution, do we? So this is part of the knotty problem that we have, which is that we're trying to redistribute powers, but without any kind of framework. And I guess your point, Nigel, is rationally, that's what we would want. Ed has described my experience of these things with central politicians is a fraction of Ed's, but I totally agree with it. That they're not in the business of thinking about how power gets redistributed back to the citizens. There's nobody who cares about that, I think, or maybe there's like 1 out of 600. Maybe it's Caroline Lucas, maybe, but it stops about there. So most of them are just playing politics and playing politics, to win, to do good stuff in their heads, but they're not in that business. So for me, it's just the question of whatever the rational strategy we have about a federal UK or English regionalism or any story like that, what we know through the whole post-war experience is that's not really on any politician's agenda. It happened in Scotland because people got organised and put it on the agenda. And that's the only way I can see. So it's more about like, how do you get started? You cannot just rationally say, hey, I know that we need actually, there are plenty of people doing that. I think Michael Mulvey on this call has already said, and this would be a rational constitution, but then what? How do we take that further? That is the big question, and it's quite tactical. Then it's quite opportunistic. How do you begin anything new? By trying, I guess. Sorry, that's a messy answer, but that's as best as I've got.
Thanks, Simon. And to you, Ed?
Yes, sorry there. That was actually my computer crashing, not the internet, and it's a brand new computer, so that's really annoying. I think where we were was just a quick point to emphasise. I mean, never underestimate how detached the London establishment is from the entire rest of the United Kingdom. And this is not just the politicians. I mean, the civil service is as centralising, if not more centralising than anyone. The London media, perceives it would be losing power if you allow it to stretch out here, the think tanks and so on. So the entire politico-media structure is of a centralist mindset, and B, completely detached from the rest of the country. Hence its surprise at the Brexit vote The other point that I wanted to make was that was twofold. The other opportunity that is around it, I mean, opportunity, but I don't want to, it's not doom and gloom, but I mean, the way the climate thing is going and the pollution thing is going, it's getting worse at a far faster rate than any scientist expected. And what was wrong, you may remember 10, 20 years ago, there was a lot of rubbishing of the forecasts and all the rest of it. Well, yeah, they were wrong because their worst case scenario was not worse enough. Now, in terms of responding, and as I say, this is not doom and gloom, I mean, it's happening and we're going to have to deal with it unless we're going to give up and sort of drown, which I don't think is a very active or optimistic or indeed even human way of dealing with it. We're going to respond to it. But we're going to have to respond to it in all sorts of ways. And a lot of that is going to be about local action. A lot of it is going to be indeed very local action, like, have you got your flood boards ready for your house in, I don't know, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, when flooding becomes a regularity? Your points moved up the wall. What are you going to do about sourcing food, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So this is another opportunity which is going to put tremendous pressure on central government and is going to force that issue. But otherwise, I think we're actually in quite a good position. But yeah, let's get prepared.
Great. Thanks, Ed. Going to open up now again to any comments, questions. If someone would like to raise their hand on the participant list, I will allow you to talk and to contribute live and in session. Let's just see.
There was a point. I don't know if Stuart Arnold is still on the call, but there was a question in the chat, Joe, about polling, and I'm sure Stuart's been involved in some polling stuff, and maybe you could get Stuart to come on board if he's not too shy, and he could maybe just talk about, it might be a question, but I think it's just an interesting point, because there has been some actual polling on what people think. And
I mean, Stuart, you have been calling. A hand has been placed upon your shoulder. I will allow you to talk, and if you don't want to,
sorry, Stuart,
contribute, that is all right.
Demute.
He is muted, but he might have wandered off. You never know.
Yes, just wandered off.
I'm
eating my tea.
Tea.
Sorry, Stuart, that was unfair.
We don't mind you eating your tea.
That's all right.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. I mean, I suppose that, I take it you've both been looking at some of the comments on, in the chat there as well. And there's a few comments around, George asking again about approaching someone like the Resolution Foundation or Joseph Rowntree to help establish a convention. Ruth talking about there's been this new sort of democracy network that's kind of, UK movements potentially tying into. And as you said, there's lots of good stuff going on a kind of on a grassroots level here, isn't there?
The thing, I mean, that Ruth, that democracy network, it looks like you're involved with it, and I've been involved with it, and so there are literally hundreds of organizations doing stuff or trying to do stuff about democracy and improving it and citizen empowerment and all the rest of it. And Joseph Rowntree has funded this bringing together, to creating a network that means that, well, first of all, people know each other exist, but then people can start to work together, and there is more power because there's a bigger number. And so, for example, I'm not sure whether it's ever happened or not, but there was it a set of local council elections in the Isle of Wight? And there is, believe it or not, an Isle of Wight democracy organisation whose name I can't remember. But that came together with a number of cross-cutting organisations to focus on, it may well have been voter registration and getting people to vote in order to bring about some change on the council. And drawing in all of these activities, I mean, in this case, or all of these organisations, sorry, in this case to Yorkshire, to focus and concentrate and cohere resources on bringing change here is exactly what's needed.
Yeah, I mean, I put a hand up for the for Democratic Yorkshire. Philip Hardstone, who's also on the chat, is coordinating that and has brought together several of us. And I think anybody who's on this chat who's interested should reach out to Philip, and that would be one way of beginning, because we've created a bit of a structure just as a way to begin the journey. I think it's so bad that I'm probably one of the youngest people in the group. So if you're younger than me, we definitely need you. I think and actually part of the reason I was really keen to work with Opus on this is I think there are a lot of people in their 20s and 30s who probably feel the lack of democratic clout in society, are passionate about things, but are not connecting that to this debate. And I think if we could start to connect those bridges, that would really help, I think. And I know that's hard sometimes, because if you're passionate about the environment or this cause or that cause, then why do you want to get drawn into talking about a new constitution for Yorkshire? But I suppose I just feel like if you just really think it through, like as Ed says, the way I think about it for the climate crisis is almost every solution you need requires democratic action. It requires us to actually take back control of things, land, energy, water, and say, no, we need these things to function right for us. Like, actually, it's quite a socialist agenda, if that's a bit of a frightening word, isn't it? But it is about saying, this is our stuff. It's frightening in a way how we've allowed privatization to go under the name of investment, when actually what's actually happening is people are taking control of things in Yorkshire and misappropriating them and making them not work for Yorkshire folk. And of course, that's true generally. But I think that kind of issue might be a critical one. If you think about how you want to make Sheffield carbon neutral, you've got to start acting collectively for Sheffield. You've got to create energy strategies for Sheffield. You've got to create insulation strategies for Sheffield. You've got to start investing in things that actually draw carbon out of the atmosphere for Sheffield. Obviously, we can't do all the work for the world on our own, but our responsibility is to do those things together. If Yorkshire really pulled its weight, there's all sorts of exciting things we could do to make a bigger contribution. But we need democratic constitutional power to do that.
Ed, can come to you in just a short comment, if that's okay.
Well, I was just going to chuck in health here, because the health service debate gets into, the NHS is a great, wonderful institution created by Labour, which, therefore the other lot have always disliked and therefore trying to privatise as much as possible. If you look at health services around Europe, national health services, all organised in slightly different ways often, many of them work better. And it's like, okay, if we're looking at health, let's look at the rest of Europe and how therefore we might establish a health service in Yorkshire. Just one other brief thing, someone said to me the other day, just out of the blue, they said, we were talking about health, and they said health and business just don't mix. And it's not the fault of the business people involved, and it's not the fault of the people in the health service. But if you put these two systems together, they just don't work. And I thought, that's a very profound point.
Yeah.
It is. And I suppose, being 34, not that I feel I can speak for all young people, but briefly just reflecting on that is, I suppose, There's a book written called Generation Left, which talks about how there's been this massive progressive swing in sort of in young people like Keir Milburn. And I think, the experience of a lot of young people in our democracy is they've never won anything.
Right.
Never won an election, nothing that they've, lost Brexit, and I think we are seeing that both activating and energizing elements of young people in terms of getting engaged in politics, but also perhaps actively disengaging other elements of our generation who've just sort of, well, what's the point in any kind of level of engagement in this process? I'm going to open up to maybe one more question or comment, and then we'll finish with final remarks, both from Simon and Ed there.
Stuart's finished his dinner.
Oh yeah, let's bring Stuart in. I will allow you to talk, Stuart. You should be able to unmute yourself there. Welcome, Stuart.
Yep. Are you okay? Sorry about that. I had a mouthful of bean sprouts. It wasn't pretty. So it's good you didn't turn on the camera. Just to say that the poll, you're asking me about the polling. We did some as part of the Big Yorkshire conversation in terms of what people thought around issues of branding, identity, and so on. But the ones that were interesting, I think, for this conversation were about devolution. And just to sort of tell you briefly what those are, most people, not surprisingly, did not feel informed about the devolution or levelling up agenda. That was well over half. As in fact, a very tiny proportion felt they were very informed. Almost 3/4, 73%, agreed that Yorkshire should have more decision-making powers in the same way Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and London have. There was a split as to whether those powers should be to a regional assembly or parliament or to enhancing the powers of local authorities. The assembly just won, but was a higher proportion of respondents, but not by much. And of course, in a way, given the discussion you've had already, those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive anyway. But if there was a referendum on establishing a Yorkshire Parliament, there would be overwhelmingly would win, with twice as many people saying yes, 56.3%, than no, 23%.
Wow.
And those, I think, are the figures that are probably most interesting to this discussion.
Wow.
Great.
It's not a bad starting point, is it, for us?
No, just to say also that was a fairly large sample of around 4,500 people responding to an online survey. So I think it's probably the biggest survey that's been done on those issues. And in answer to George, it's on the Yorkshire Society website. You can find the full report there.
Wow. I mean, that's massively impressive. I mean, if you compare that even with where Wales has got to now, yeah, better get started on that constitution, you know.
which potentially I think is a kind of good moment to finish on, I suppose. I mean, just coming maybe for one last comment here to Simon and Ed, and maybe I'll ask you the title of the event, and you can try and give a brief summation or maybe a kind of a parting thought, which is, how can we achieve a democratic Yorkshire? And let's start with you, Simon.
I think, get involved, join in. If you've on this call today, then that's something, isn't it? That's a beginning. And we hear that once asked, people are for it. So let's just start joining up and having the conversation. And I hope that next year with Opus, we will run another event like this, maybe in a different, broader format, maybe think about that. But and let's start thinking about how we can recruit people into this kind of conversation in a more genuine way, to go alongside the other good initiatives, but aren't quite hitting the spot on this issue, I think.
Thanks, Simon and Ed.
The thought that comes to my mind is a book came out year or so ago called "You Are What You Read," and the point they're making is that, you know, that all of the information that we receive from television, radio, newspapers, obviously the whole of social media and all the rest of it, it does shape our thinking and shape what we think we can do. And bear in mind that all of these structures, everything that we have, every organization, they're all human inventions and they can be reinvented. And I've changed very much what I read, and I try to avoid all national news on radio and TV. Rarely is it actually news. It's often just a sort of political boxing match for its entertainment. I avoid as much as possible national newspapers. There's a thing here called Nation Cymru, which it's proper news. It's an online thing. There's a thing called The Conversation. I do read bits of The Economist. I get The Atlantic from the States. I try and get some French stuff. But just try and change what you read, because as soon as, if you haven't, my apologies, and for God's sake, don't watch television or listen to radio news.
That is a good note to end on, and it's also something Rutger Bergman talks about quite very convincingly, doesn't he? That if you're watching TV and radio news, it's one way to guarantee that you're going to feel depressed. Exactly, yeah. So just leaves to me to thank you very much, both Ed and Simon, for your talks and your time and your reflections this evening. I'd like to thank everyone very much on the chat for attending tonight and for all your comments and engagement in both the questions and in the text box as well. That is massively appreciated. This event has been recorded live. It will be immediately up on YouTube afterwards, so there won't be minutes of this event, but you can watch it back if you so wish, and that's on the Festival of Debate YouTube channel. You can just Google that or search for Festival of Debate on YouTube and you'll be able to find it immediately after this event ends. My name is Joe Chris. I'm from Opus Independence and the Festival of Debate. Thank you very much for joining us all tonight. Hope you all enjoy a late dinner or a sort of and the rest of your evening. Thanks very much. Good night.